February 23, 1945. Hill 362, Iwo Jima. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams crawled forward with 70 pounds of steel, fuel and compressed gas strapped to his back. Through the smoke and volcanic ash, he could see what remained of his demolition unit. All 6 members were dead or wounded. 4 riflemen provided covering fire as Williams moved toward a concrete pillbox that had stopped 3 Marine companies cold. Inside his flamethrowers' tanks, approximately 4 gallons of diesel and aviation fuel mixture waited. He had maybe 7 seconds of burn time. 7 seconds to expose himself completely. 7 seconds during which Japanese machine gunners would have a clear target marked by brilliant orange flame. 7 seconds that military statisticians had calculated was about half the average combat lifespan of a Marine flamethrower operator. The numbers were staggering. The mathematics were brutal. Of the flamethrower operators deployed to Iwo Jima, 1 battalion sustained a casualty rate of 92%. Not wounded. Casualties. Dead, missing, or so severely injured they could never return to combat. This is the story of how America's most effective weapon became its most lethal assignment, and why the men who carried fire into battle had less chance of survival than anyone else on the bloodiest battlefield in Marine Corps history. The weapon itself seemed deceptively simple. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in 1944, consisted of 3 cylindrical tanks mounted in a backpack configuration. 2 larger tanks held approximately 4 gallons of fuel, a carefully engineered mixture of diesel oil and high-octane aviation gasoline, designed to burn longer and hotter than pure gasoline. Between these fuel tanks sat a smaller cylinder containing compressed nitrogen, the propellant that would force the fuel mixture through the system at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. A flexible rubber hose connected the backpack to the firing wand, essentially a metal tube with a pistol grip and 2 triggers. The rear trigger released nitrogen pressure, forcing fuel through the system. The front trigger activated a cartridge-based ignition system, 5 igniter cartridges arranged in a revolver configuration that provided reliable spark ignition even under combat conditions. When fully loaded with fuel and propellant, the M2 weighed 70 pounds. The weapon had an effective range of approximately 20 meters, though under ideal conditions the flame could reach 40 meters. But effectiveness and range were measured in ideal circumstances, and Iwo Jima provided nothing ideal. The total burn time was 7 to 8 seconds of continuous fire, though operators learned quickly to fire in short bursts to maximize their limited fuel supply. Each burst consumed roughly half a gallon per second, creating a roiling fireball of diesel-fueled flame that could penetrate bunker openings, flow into cave systems, and most critically, consume the oxygen needed for human survival within enclosed spaces. The weapon killed not just through burns but through asphyxiation, turning Japanese defensive positions into ovens that baked their occupants alive, or suffocated them when the flames consumed all available air. The men who volunteered to carry these weapons understood the danger, though perhaps not fully until they faced combat. Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942, driven by patriotic fervour after Pearl Harbor and the heroic stories emerging from Guadalcanal. After completing boot camp at Paris Island, he could have remained stateside at the naval base in New London, Connecticut, serving as a guard for the duration of the war. Instead, hearing the combat stories from Marines rotating back from the Pacific, he requested combat duty. His path led to the Demolition and Flamethrower School at Camp Lejeune in July 1944. The training was brutally technical. Instructors taught the mechanical operation of the M2, how to prime the ignition system, how to maintain proper nitrogen pressure, how to detect fuel leaks that could turn the operator into a human torch. They learned to fire from a specific stance, leaning forward to counteract the weapon's significant recoil when compressed nitrogen exploded through the system. Woody Williams remembered the learning curve vividly. He stated later that he couldn't count the number of times he singed off his eyebrows and arm hair learning to control the weapon. The propellant's force created substantial kick when fired. Unless the operator braced properly and leaned into the discharge, the barrel could point skyward, raining burning fuel down onto the operator himself. Williams witnessed one Marine, untrained but desperate, pick up a fallen flamethrower and fire it without proper stance. The man was saturated with flame and killed instantly. But technical proficiency was only the beginning. The real training involved understanding how to use the weapon tactically, how to approach fortified positions, how to coordinate with rifle squads providing suppressing fire, and critically, how to survive long enough to engage the target. The training emphasized that flamethrower operators never worked alone. Standard doctrine called for a 4 to 6 man fire team, the flamethrower operator, an assistant carrying extra fuel cylinders and ignition cartridges, and at least 2 riflemen, preferably with Browning automatic rifles, whose job was to provide suppressing fire as the flamethrower team approached enemy positions. In theory, the rifleman would pin down Japanese defenders while the flamethrower got close enough to engage. The assistant would help the operator reload or take over if the primary operator was hit. It was a sound tactical doctrine. On Iwo Jima, it rarely worked as planned. Corporal Williams and Private Rybakiewicz were part of a much larger story, one that began not with American planning, but with Japanese determination. The architect of Iwo Jima's defences was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a career officer from a samurai lineage who had spent time in the United States during the 1920s, training with cavalry units at Fort Bliss, Texas. Unlike many Japanese commanders who viewed Americans as soft and undisciplined, Kuribayashi understood exactly what he faced. He had written to his wife years earlier that the United States was the last country Japan should fight, describing American industrial capacity as huge and fabulous, the people as energetic and versatile. He knew American fighting ability should never be underestimated. In May 1944, when Prime Minister Hideki Tojo personally assigned Kuribayashi to defend Iwo Jima, the general understood he couldn't win, but he could make victory so expensive that America might reconsider invading the Japanese mainland. Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944 and immediately began transforming the volcanic island into the most formidable defensive position in the Pacific War. He broke fundamentally with traditional Japanese doctrine. Instead of defending the beaches and attempting to push invaders back into the sea, he would let them land unopposed. Rather than launching suicidal banzai charges that wasted men for minimal gain, he would husband his forces and make Americans root out every position individually. His strategy was simple and devastating: inflict maximum casualties through defense in depth, protracted resistance, and coordinated firepower from mutually supporting positions that could not be destroyed by naval bombardment or aerial attack. To achieve this, Kuribayashi mobilized his 23,000-man garrison in the most ambitious engineering project the Japanese had undertaken. 25% of his entire force was dedicated to construction and tunneling. Mining engineers were brought from Japan to design an underground fortress that would be virtually immune to bombardment. The island's volcanic rock, composed of soft pumice and harder basalt layers, could be carved with hand tools in many areas. Where the rock was too hard, construction crews used explosives and pneumatic drills. Over 8 months, Japanese engineers carved over 11 miles of tunnels into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock, creating a 3-dimensional fortress that extended as deep as 75 feet below the surface. The tunnel network was breathtaking in its sophistication. Major chambers capable of holding 300 to 400 men served as barracks, command posts, and storage facilities for ammunition, food, and water. Smaller caves, some accommodating only 2 or 3 soldiers, served as fighting positions. The tunnels connected these positions in an intricate web that allowed troops to move unseen between locations, to reinforce threatened areas, to retreat when a position became untenable, and to reoccupy positions Americans thought they had cleared. Ventilation shafts provided fresh air circulation, though the sulphurous volcanic fumes required special attention in many areas, Multiple entrances and exits ensured that troops wouldn't be trapped if one entrance was destroyed. The Nanpo bunker, housing the naval headquarters, sat 90 feet underground with enough supplies to sustain its garrison for 3 months. Above ground, Kuribayashi's engineers constructed over 600 concrete pillboxes and blockhouses. These weren't hastily improvised positions. They were reinforced concrete fortifications with walls 4 feet thick, impervious to anything short of direct hits from battleship guns. The pillboxes were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, meaning that each position could support its neighbours. If Marines approached one pillbox, they would come under fire from adjacent positions. The Japanese installed loopholes that allowed machine gunners to fire while remaining almost completely protected. They camouflaged positions with volcanic ash and scrub vegetation, making them nearly invisible until they opened fire. They positioned weapons to cover the beaches, the 2 operational airfields, and every natural approach route across the island. The defensive armament was formidable. Kuribayashi's garrison possessed approximately 300 anti-aircraft guns, 120 large naval guns ranging from 4.7 to 6 inches, 438 artillery pieces, 69 anti-tank guns, and 23 tanks. They stockpiled 22 million rounds of small-caliber ammunition. Hundreds of Japanese sniper nests and camouflaged machine gun positions covered virtually every square yard of the island. Among the more terrifying weapons were 320mm spigot mortars, massive projectiles that arced high into the air before plunging down with devastating effect. Kuribayashi engineered his defensive network so that every part of Iwo Jima was subject to Japanese defensive fire. There would be no safe areas for attacking Marines. The strategic importance of this 8-square-mile volcanic rock lay in its location. Iwo Jima sat almost exactly halfway between American air bases in the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, approximately 750 miles from each. 2 operational airfields and a third under construction made it valuable real estate. For the Japanese, it served as an early warning station, radioing reports of incoming B-29 bomber formations back to the home islands, giving air defences time to prepare. Japanese fighters based on Iwo harassed American bombers en route to Japan. For the Americans, capturing Iwo would eliminate this threat, provide a base for fighter escorts that could protect B-29s all the way to Japanese cities, and offer an emergency landing field for damaged bombers that couldn't make the long flight back to the Marianas. The strategic calculus seemed clear. The human cost would prove almost incalculable. American planning for Operation Detachment, as the invasion was codenamed, began in September 1944. The Marines would provide the assault force, the 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, totaling approximately 70,000 Marines and organic Navy personnel. Supporting them would be the largest fleet yet assembled in the Pacific, approximately 450 ships including 12 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and countless cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, understood the difficulties ahead. Intelligence officers had analysed aerial reconnaissance photographs. They had studied Japanese defensive tactics from previous island battles. Smith requested 10 consecutive days of naval bombardment prior to the landing to soften up the defences. He was granted only 3 days, a decision driven by Admiral Nimitz's tight schedule for subsequent operations, including the planned invasion of Okinawa. The preliminary bombardment began on February 16, 1945. For 3 days, battleships, cruisers and destroyers pounded Iwo Jima with thousands of shells, while carrier aircraft bombed and strafed identified targets. It was an impressive display of firepower, but largely ineffective. The underground positions were immune to bombardment. The reinforced concrete pillboxes could withstand everything except direct hits from the largest caliber naval guns. The craters created by the barrage would provide cover for Japanese defenders and obstacles for attacking Marines. Many positions remained completely undamaged, their camouflage so effective that American observers never spotted them. February 19, 1945. dawned grey and cold. At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines landed on the southeastern beaches of Iwo Jima. They encountered an unexpected obstacle immediately. The beach wasn't sand, it was volcanic ash, steep terraces of soft grey pumice that provided no footing. Men sank to their ankles with every step. Tracked vehicles bogged down. Tanks struggled to climb the 15-foot terraces. Marines attempting to dig foxholes found the loose ash collapsing back into any hole they scraped. The volcanic debris was so fine it clogged weapons, jammed mechanical systems, and infiltrated every piece of equipment. And for the first hour, there was almost no enemy fire. Kuribayashi's plan was unfolding perfectly. He let the Marines land unopposed. He let them struggle up the beaches, let them bunch together as follow-on waves arrived and congested the landing areas. He waited until approximately 30,000 Marines were ashore, packed into a beachhead barely 1,000 yards deep. Then he opened fire. The result was catastrophic. Artillery, mortars and machine guns opened up simultaneously from positions across the island. Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano dominating the southern end of Iwo, erupted with fire from dozens of hidden positions. The high ground to the north, bristling with artillery, poured shells into the packed beaches. Marines died by the hundreds in the first hour of sustained fire. The loose volcanic terrain that had hindered their advance now became a death trap, too soft to dig into for cover, too unstable to run through quickly. Tracked vehicles and tanks, desperately needed to break the stalemate, struggled to get off the beaches. Some were hit by artillery before they could maneuver. Others bogged down and became stationary targets. Private First Class James Norton, part of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Division, remembered the terror. Nobody talked as they approached the beach. God only knew what was ahead of them. The optimistic intelligence estimates that predicted light resistance and a quick victory evaporated in the first hours of combat. By nightfall on D-Day, the Marines had carved out precarious footholds, but at a cost of over 519 killed in action and over 2,400 total casualties, and this was just the beginning. Ahead lay 5 weeks of the most brutal close-quarters combat in Marine Corps history. The flamethrower operators landed with their units on D-Day, though most weren't committed to action immediately. The initial assault focused on securing the beachhead and pushing inland. But by D+2, February 21st, it became clear that conventional weapons were insufficient. Japanese positions were too well constructed, too expertly camouflaged, too mutually supporting. Artillery and naval bombardment could destroy some surface positions, but were useless against the tunnel networks. Infantry assaults without specialized weapons resulted in horrific casualties. The Marines needed their demolition engineers and flamethrower operators. Corporal Williams landed on February 21st with the 3rd Marine Division. His job title was Demolition Sergeant, but his primary weapon was the M2 flamethrower. He supervised a 6-man flamethrower demolition unit, specialists trained to approach and destroy fortified positions using a combination of explosives and liquid fire. By the time Williams reached Iwo Jima, he had already seen combat on Guam, where he first learned how effective and how dangerous the flamethrower could be against Japanese fortifications. But nothing on Guam prepared him for Iwo. The Marine doctrine for using flamethrowers was straightforward in theory. When Marines encountered a fortified position that stopped their advance, they would call up a flamethrower team. Riflemen, typically armed with M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles, would establish a base of fire, pouring suppressing fire into the target pillbox or cave entrance to keep defenders from exposing themselves. Under this covering fire, the flamethrower operator, accompanied by his assistant and perhaps additional riflemen, would advance as close as possible to the target. Ideally, the operator wanted to be within 20 meters, the weapon's effective range. Then he would engage, firing burst after burst of flaming fuel into the opening until he had exhausted his fuel supply or the target was neutralized. Reality on Iwo Jima deviated catastrophically from this doctrine. The Japanese defensive network meant that Marines couldn't suppress one position without being fired upon from others. The interlocking fields of fire made it nearly impossible to approach any single pillbox safely. Japanese snipers, positioned in elevated locations throughout the defensive zone, specifically targeted flamethrower operators. The bright orange flame, visible for hundreds of meters, acted as a beacon. Once an operator fired his weapon, every Japanese soldier in the vicinity knew exactly where he was. The operator couldn't move quickly while firing. The weapon's weight, the need to aim carefully, and the resistance of the hose connecting the backpack to the firing wand all slowed movement. The operator was essentially stationary while engaging a target, presenting an ideal target for counterfire. The backpack itself was a vulnerability. Though the tanks were thick steel, reportedly bulletproof under most circumstances, they weren't invulnerable. A direct hit from a larger caliber weapon could puncture a tank. The nitrogen tank, under 300 pounds of pressure, could rupture from concussion or shrapnel. If the nitrogen tank ruptured while the operator was firing, the sudden loss of pressure could cause a violent blowback. If a fuel tank was punctured while the operator was firing and flame was already present, the result was immediate immolation. Japanese soldiers understood this and aimed accordingly. The psychological burden was immense. Flamethrower operators were priority targets. The moment they engaged, they would draw fire from every enemy soldier who could see them. Their chances of survival decreased with every mission. The nature of their weapon made surrender impossible. Japanese soldiers who saw flamethrower operators approaching their positions understood they faced death by fire. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose. Some would attempt to bayonet charge the operator before he could engage. Others would hold their fire until the operator was completely vulnerable, then open up with everything they had. On February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, Woody Williams found himself in the situation every flamethrower operator dreaded. His company had been attempting to cross one of the island's 2 operational airfields, but was pinned down by intense fire from multiple Japanese pillboxes. 3 companies had already tried to advance across the open ground. All had been stopped cold with heavy casualties. Marine tanks had attempted to support the advance, but were knocked out or driven back by Japanese anti-tank guns and artillery. The battalion commander called a meeting in a shell crater to avoid Japanese observation. He asked Williams, as the only flamethrower and demolition expert still operational, if he would take on the pillboxes. Williams knew the odds. All the other members of his flamethrower demolition unit were already casualties. He would be working essentially alone. But he also knew that without those pillboxes neutralized, his entire company would remain pinned down, taking casualties from machine gun and artillery fire, with no way to advance or retreat safely. He selected 4 riflemen to provide covering fire. Their job was nearly impossible. They had to suppress Japanese positions while Williams moved within effective range. 2 of those 4 riflemen would not survive the afternoon. What followed was later described in Williams's Medal of Honor citation as 4 hours of the most conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Williams crawled forward toward the first pillbox, his 70-pound flamethrower dragging through volcanic ash. Bullets from Japanese machine guns ricocheted off his tanks. The thick steel held. He got within 25 yards and rolled a massive ball of flame into the pillbox entrance, silencing the position. He crawled to the next position, spotted a wisp of smoke escaping from a ventilation hole in the reinforced concrete roof, climbed on top of the fortification, and fired the flamethrower nozzle directly into the vent, killing everyone inside. Over 4 hours, Williams returned to his own lines 5 separate times to refill his flamethrower tanks and obtain fresh ignition cartridges. 5 times he moved back into the open under fire to engage more positions. During one approach, he faced Japanese soldiers charging him with bayonets, attempting to kill him before he could fire. Williams engaged them with flame from point-blank range. The flamethrower consumed all available oxygen as it created the fireball, asphyxiating the charging soldiers instantly. At another point, Williams found himself under fire from 3 directions simultaneously. He had no choice but to continue moving forward, as stopping would mean certain death. The covering fire from his 4 riflemen, depleted to 3, then 2 as casualties mounted, barely kept Japanese defenders suppressed long enough for Williams to engage each position. When it was over, Williams had single-handedly destroyed 7 major pillboxes that had stopped 3 Marine companies cold. He had used dozens of gallons of flamethrower fuel. He had survived injuries that would earn him a Purple Heart. And he had demonstrated why flamethrower operators, despite the 92% casualty rate, were considered the most valuable specialists on Iwo Jima. Williams's experience, while extraordinary in its success, was typical in its danger. Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz faced similar circumstances repeatedly during his 30 days on Iwo Jima. Rybakiewicz, carrying 90 pounds of equipment, including his flamethrower, hit the beach on February 21st. His first action was to fall face first into volcanic ash and vomit from seasickness. Then he engaged the enemy. Over the next month, he would take out 7 pillboxes and caves, each engagement a separate nightmare of exposure, fire and counterfire. On March 8th, Rybakiewicz's unit was advancing through a narrow gully when they encountered a pillbox positioned slightly above them on elevated ground. Before they could withdraw from the confined space, 4 Marines were killed and 5 wounded by machine gun fire. Rybakiewicz gave first aid to 2 wounded men and somehow managed to carry them back to the dressing station under fire. A hand grenade exploded nearby, shrapnel scraping across his knuckles, but he didn't think it was serious enough to report. He returned to the fighting position, asked a nearby Browning automatic rifle gunner to provide cover, and advanced with his flamethrower. Agitated by seeing his friends killed and wounded in the narrow passage, he moved up and gave the pillbox what he described as a long squirt, burning it out completely. The next day, a doctor looked at his bloody hand and evacuated him temporarily for treatment. After receiving first aid and having his hand wrapped, Rybakiewicz returned to the front. He later admitted that was the scariest moment for him, realizing he had to return to combat after treatment, knowing he would face the same dangers again and again until he was killed or the battle ended. The casualty rate among flamethrower operators stemmed from multiple factors working in brutal combination. First was the simple mathematical reality of close-range engagement. To use the weapon effectively, the operator had to approach within 20 meters of enemy positions. At that distance, even mediocre marksmen couldn't miss. Japanese defenders, far from being the poor marksmen American propaganda claimed, proved devastatingly accurate. The myth of Japanese poor marksmanship died at Iwo Jima, along with thousands of Marines. Second was the conspicuousness of the weapon in use. The orange flame was visible across the entire battlefield. Smoke from burning positions marked the operator's location. Even when not firing, the distinctive outline of the backpack identified the operator as a priority target. Third was the limited duration of operations. 7 to 8 seconds of total burn time meant the operator had to make every burst count. But short bursts still created flame that marked his position. The operator had to fire multiple bursts to neutralize most targets, meaning multiple exposures, multiple opportunities for enemy fire to find him. Fourth was the mobility penalty. A Marine rifleman carrying an M1 Garand and basic combat load could sprint, dive for cover, zigzag to avoid fire. A flamethrower operator carrying 70 pounds of steel tanks on his back, connected to a firing wand by a cumbersome rubber hose, could not move quickly. He couldn't throw himself prone without risking damage to his equipment. He couldn't sprint without the backpack's weight throwing off his balance. He certainly couldn't fire accurately while moving at speed. He had to advance deliberately, remaining vulnerable longer than any rifleman would dare. Fifth was the psychological targeting. Japanese soldiers understood that flamethrower operators represented their greatest threat. Artillery and naval bombardment were terrifying, but often ineffective against underground positions. Rifle fire and grenades could be endured, but flame, flowing into tunnels and pillboxes, consuming oxygen, creating unbearable heat, represented a death more horrible than any other. Japanese defenders reserved special hatred for flamethrower operators and made killing them a priority. The sixth factor was perhaps most insidious, the arithmetic of attrition. Every time an operator engaged a position, he faced approximately the same level of risk. Over time, cumulative probability worked against survival. An operator might survive one mission with luck and skill. He might survive 5 missions. But over weeks of combat, engaging dozens of positions, the statistical probability of taking a hit approached certainty. The military statisticians who calculated that average combat lifespan of 4 minutes weren't measuring a single engagement. They were measuring the cumulative time under fire across multiple missions until the operator became a casualty. The seventh factor was friendly fire risk. Marine artillery, naval bombardment, and close air support were essential to soften Japanese positions before infantry assault. But these supporting fires were tremendously dangerous to troops in close proximity. Flamethrower operators, by necessity, worked closer to enemy positions than anyone else. Short rounds from friendly artillery killed Americans as surely as Japanese fire. Naval shells landing even slightly off target could obliterate entire squads. When Marines requested supporting fires within danger-close distances, they accepted the risk. Flamethrower operators, working within meters of enemy positions, existed in a constant danger zone for friendly fire. The death of Corporal Edgar O. Anthony illustrated the random horror. On March 3rd, Anthony was serving with Company Y, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, 5th Marine Division. He was carrying his flamethrower forward when a Japanese sniper's bullet struck the fuel tanks on his back. The impact caused a catastrophic fuel leak. The diesel and aviation gas mixture drenched Anthony. A split second later, the igniter on his weapon sparked. Anthony was engulfed in flame instantaneously. He burned to death in front of his squad. His death was initially classified as missing in action, his body so badly burned that identification was impossible on the battlefield. He was later identified from dental records and interred at Manila American Cemetery. Anthony would have turned 23 in April. He never made it off Iwo Jima. The introduction of flamethrower tanks represented an attempt to reduce operator casualties by providing armour protection. The M4A3R3 Zippo tank, named after the popular lighter, was a standard Sherman tank with its main gun replaced by a large-capacity flamethrower. The Navy Seabees, working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii under Colonel Unmacht, developed the CBH-1 and improved CBH-2 flamethrower systems that could be mounted on Sherman tanks. These mechanized flamethrowers operated on 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, providing a range of 400 feet, dramatically longer than the man-portable M2. The tank's armour protected the crew from small arms fire and most artillery fragments. The fuel capacity was vastly greater, 300 gallons compared to the M2's 4 gallons. The tanks could sustain fire for extended periods, could manoeuvre under direct fire, and most importantly, didn't expose vulnerable human operators to the same degree as portable flamethrowers. 8 of these flamethrower tanks landed on Iwo Jima on D-Day, February 19th. They weren't used until D+2, as commanders were initially uncertain about their effectiveness. But once committed to action, they proved devastating. The Zippo tanks could approach pillboxes and cave entrances that would be suicide for infantry. They could pour hundreds of gallons of napalm into openings, creating infernos that destroyed everything inside. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was profound. Multiple Marine commanders stated after the battle that flamethrower tanks were the single most effective weapon used on Iwo Jima. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, commanding Company C, 26th Marines, stated bluntly that in his view it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won the battle. But the tanks couldn't replace man-portable flamethrowers. The island's terrain, honeycombed with ravines, steep slopes and obstacles, limited where tanks could go. Many Japanese positions were accessible only on foot. Caves with narrow entrances couldn't be engaged by tanks. Pillboxes in defilade, hidden in drawers or reverse slopes, were beyond reach of mechanized flamethrowers. And so, despite the introduction of tanks, the need for operators carrying portable M2 units remained critical. The operators continued to die. By the battle's end on March 26th, after 36 days of continuous combat, the casualty figures told a story of unprecedented violence. Marine casualties totaled approximately 24,000. Of these, nearly 7,000 were killed in action, died of wounds, or were missing and presumed dead. Roughly one Marine or corpsman became a casualty for every 3 who landed. This was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, more costly than Tarawa, Saipan, or Guam. It was the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties, testament to Kuribayashi's defensive genius and his willingness to sacrifice every man in his command to inflict maximum American losses. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died, many incinerated in their positions by flamethrowers, others buried alive when their tunnel systems were collapsed by explosives, still others killed in the final desperate fighting. Kuribayashi himself was believed killed in action during a final counterattack on March 26th, though his body was never definitively identified. His strategy of defense in depth, attrition warfare, and refusal to waste men in banzai charges had worked exactly as intended. He made America bleed. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. 12 of these were for actions involving the elimination of enemy positions, the kind of close-quarters fighting where flamethrowers proved essential. Only 6 of those 12 recipients survived to receive their medals. The others died in the actions for which they were recognized. Woody Williams received his Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in October 1945. He was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from World War II when he died in 2022 at age 98. For decades after the war, Williams struggled with post-traumatic stress, haunted by the faces of men he had killed, the screams of Japanese soldiers dying in flame, the memories of friends who died beside him. It wasn't until 1962, when he experienced a religious renewal, that his nightmares finally ended. He spent the rest of his life working with veterans organizations, establishing the Herschel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation, and speaking about the costs of war. Joseph Rybakiewicz survived Iwo Jima, but carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. The hand that was wounded by grenade shrapnel never fully healed. More difficult were the psychological burdens. He kept a photograph of a Japanese soldier's wife and children, taken from an enemy soldier he had killed. He kept the soldier's medical kit and bayonet. These items bothered him his entire life. Before his death, he asked his wife to try returning them to Japanese authorities, a futile attempt to make amends for what he had done as a flamethrower operator. The Japanese consulate in San Francisco showed little interest. Rybakiewicz wrestled with the moral weight of his actions. In the caves, especially toward the end when Japanese soldiers were running out of ammunition, you never knew how many people were hiding. Women, elderly, perhaps even children pressed into service. The flamethrower didn't discriminate. It killed everyone in an enclosed space, combatant and non-combatant alike. The 92% casualty rate among flamethrower operators in one battalion on Iwo Jima represents perhaps the highest casualty rate for any specialized military unit in American history. For comparison, rifle platoons on Iwo sustained approximately 33% casualties across the entire battle. Artillery units positioned behind the front lines suffered far lower rates. Even tank crews, despite the vulnerability of their vehicles to Japanese anti-tank weapons, had casualty rates lower than infantry. Only flamethrower operators faced near-certain casualty status. The 4-minute average combat lifespan calculation, while controversial among historians for its methodology, captured a truth that operators understood instinctively. Every time they engaged a target, they were rolling dice weighted heavily against survival. The question naturally arises, why volunteer? Given the appalling casualty rates, why would any Marine accept assignment to flamethrower duty? The answers were complex and varied by individual. Some, like Joseph Rybakiewicz, volunteered for combat duty out of idealism and patriotism, not initially realizing what they were volunteering for until they reached flamethrower school. Others were assigned based on physical characteristics. The ideal flamethrower operator was large and strong, capable of carrying 70 pounds of equipment in addition to his basic combat load. Corporal Womack, described by his comrades as big and husky, was popular with troops precisely because he could carry the flamethrower into combat when others couldn't manage the weight. Some volunteered because they recognized the importance of the weapon. Marines who had seen friends die attacking pillboxes without adequate support understood that flamethrowers saved lives, ironically, by being so effective at taking lives. And some continued operating flamethrowers despite casualties because of unit cohesion and responsibility to comrades. When your squad is pinned down, when friends are dying, when the only way forward requires destroying an enemy position, operators picked up flamethrowers and advanced. Private First Class Rudy Ortiz, whose Medal of Honor citation noted he had no previous experience as a flamethrower operator, repeatedly volunteered after 2 trained operators became casualties. He carried the weapon through murderous enemy fire multiple times, helping destroy 10 Japanese pillboxes before being killed on March 1st, while attempting to extract his company from heavy barrage. Ortiz wasn't trained, he wasn't assigned. He volunteered because his Marines needed him. The strategic value of Iwo Jima itself remains debated among historians. The official justification emphasized removing the early warning system, eliminating Japanese fighter harassment, and establishing emergency landing facilities. Post-war analysis noted that over 2,200 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, potentially saving 24,000 aircrew lives. However, revisionist historians like Captain Robert Burrell challenged these numbers, arguing many landings were routine refueling rather than genuine emergencies. Marines who bore the casualties hadn't been consulted in planning based on debatable strategic calculations. What's undeniable is that the battle shaped American military planning going forward. The horrific casualties convinced military planners that an invasion of mainland Japan would be catastrophically expensive. Casualty estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, where defenders fought virtually to the last man, suggested that resistance on the main islands would be even more fanatical. The casualties at Iwo Jima, combined with the even bloodier Battle of Okinawa that followed, helped convince President Truman that using atomic weapons to force Japanese surrender would, paradoxically, save lives by making invasion unnecessary. For the flamethrower operators who survived, life after Iwo Jima proved challenging. The psychological trauma was profound. Woody Williams spoke of putting memories in the recess of his mind, acknowledging that any time you take a life, there's aftermath if you've got any heart at all. The nature of flamethrower killing was particularly haunting. Riflemen could sometimes distance themselves psychologically from their victims. Artillery crews might never see the effects of their fire. But flamethrower operators saw everything. They heard the screams. They smelled burning flesh. They witnessed enemies attempting to escape the flames, engulfed in fire, thrashing until death provided release. The psychological burden of inflicting such death, even on enemies committed to killing you, was enormous. Many operators like Rybakiewicz kept souvenirs from enemy dead, then spent decades troubled by these reminders of humanity destroyed. The photograph of a Japanese soldier's wife and children was a particularly cruel memento. It reminded Rybakiewicz that every enemy he killed had been human, had possessed family and loved ones, had been someone's husband or father or son. The caves presented moral ambiguity as well. Operators couldn't always know who was inside when they engaged a cave entrance. Japanese military, certainly, but also potentially Korean labourers pressed into service, Okinawan civilians, anyone who might have taken shelter in the fortifications. The flamethrower killed indiscriminately. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not formally recognised or diagnosed for decades after World War II, affected flamethrower operators disproportionately. The combination of extended exposure to combat, the intimate nature of flamethrower killing, survivors' guilt over fallen comrades, and the moral weight of their actions created psychological burdens that manifested in nightmares, depression, substance abuse, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Many operators didn't speak about their experiences for decades. When they did speak, often in old age, the memories remained vivid and painful. The legacy of Iwo Jima shaped Marine Corps doctrine going forward. The battle validated combined arms operations that integrated infantry, armour, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. It demonstrated the critical importance of specialised weapons, particularly flamethrowers, for reducing fortified positions. Kuribayashi's defensive tactics influenced not just Japanese military thinking, but American understanding of how determined defenders could exact terrible costs, even in hopeless situations. The lessons of Iwo Jima were studied by military planners worldwide and influenced defensive doctrines from the Cold War through modern counterinsurgency operations. The Marine Corps War Memorial near Arlington National Cemetery, dedicated in 1954, depicts Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The statue has become synonymous with Marine Corps courage, sacrifice, and victory. Yet of the 6 men depicted raising the flag in that photograph, 3 died on Iwo Jima. Franklin Sousley, killed by sniper fire on March 21st, Harlan Block, killed by mortar fire on March 1st, and Michael Strank, killed by Marine artillery fire on March 1st. The monument honours all Marines, but it carries particular resonance for those who fought on Iwo Jima. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, speaking at the dedication ceremony for the 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Division cemeteries on Iwo Jima in March 1945, stated words that have echoed through Marine Corps history. Among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valour was a common virtue. That valour was demonstrated most starkly by the flamethrower operators who advanced into certain danger to protect their comrades and accomplish their mission. They understood that 92% casualty rates meant that survival was unlikely. They picked up their weapons and advanced anyway, because their brothers needed them, because the mission demanded it, because someone had to. The 70-pound flamethrower, with its 7 seconds of burn time and 20-metre effective range, was the most effective weapon Marines possessed for neutralising Japanese fortifications on Iwo Jima. It was also the most dangerous assignment in the most dangerous battle in Marine Corps history. The men who carried it paid the price. Of the operators deployed, an overwhelming majority became casualties. Those who survived carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Those who died were often unidentifiable, burned beyond recognition, buried in mass graves, or simply listed as missing in action when their bodies couldn't be recovered. Today, Iwo Jima has been returned to Japanese control. It's officially known as Iwo-to, a small correction of the name that acknowledges Japanese pronunciation. The island is minimally inhabited, used primarily as a self-defense force base, off-limits to casual visitors. The tunnels and fortifications remain, slowly crumbling but still visible. The beaches where Marines landed are unchanged, still covered in dark volcanic ash. And every year, on the anniversary of the landing, veterans who can still make the journey return. They are fewer each year, the youngest now approaching 100 years old. They gather on those beaches, stand before memorials to the fallen, and remember. Woody Williams, before his death, made dozens of trips to Iwo Jima. He met with Japanese veterans, former enemies who remembered the battle from the other side. These reunions, called reunions of honor, brought together men who had tried to kill each other, now elderly and reflective. Williams spoke at one such reunion, describing how Americans came to Iwo as enemies but left as students, having learned profound lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the costs of war. The flamethrower operators of Iwo Jima were volunteers and draftees, farm boys and city kids, college students and factory workers. They were ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They trained for weeks to master a weapon that would likely kill them. They advanced into fire and steel, carrying 70 pounds of fuel and explosives on their backs, marked by brilliant orange flame, to destroy positions that threatened their comrades. And 92% of them, in one battalion, became casualties in the process. Their story reveals the brutal reality of specialized warfare. The military understood the risks. The operators understood the risks. Yet the weapons were so effective, so essential to the mission, that the terrible cost was deemed necessary in the calculus of war, where some lives are spent to save others, where individual sacrifice serves larger objectives, where the mission demands that some walk into fire so that others might live. The mathematics of Iwo Jima were unforgiving. 7,000 Americans killed, 20,000 wounded, 21,000 Japanese killed. An 8-square-mile island purchased at the cost of more than 27,000 American casualties and near-total Japanese casualties. And among those Americans, the flamethrower operators suffered the highest proportional casualties of any unit type. They were the spear tip of the spear tip, the most vulnerable troops in the most vulnerable positions of the most brutal battle. 79 years later, as the last veterans of that battle pass into history, their legacy remains. The Marine Corps War Memorial stands in Arlington. The names of the dead are inscribed in stone. The Medal of Honor citations tell stories of extraordinary courage, but behind those citations, those memorials, those statistics, were human beings, young men who carried fire into battle, who died at rates that stagger imagination, who volunteered or were assigned to the most dangerous duty in military history and fulfilled that duty even though it killed them. The question of why 92% of flamethrower operators became casualties on Iwo Jima has a straightforward answer. Their weapon, while devastatingly effective against fortified positions, required complete vulnerability at close range to enemy positions defended by determined soldiers, who recognized them as priority targets and concentrated fire accordingly. But the deeper question endures. Joseph Rybakiewicz returned to combat after treating his wounded hand. Woody Williams crawled forward 5 separate times to reload and re-engage. Rudy Ortiz, untrained in flamethrower operations, repeatedly volunteered when trained operators fell. The answer lies not in tactical doctrine or strategic necessity, but in the bonds between Marines, in the unwillingness to let comrades die when you might save them, in the recognition that duty sometimes requires self-sacrifice, and in the courage to act when acting means probably dying. These men were not suicidal. They were not unaware of danger. They were fully conscious of the risks and advanced anyway. That is not foolishness or ignorance. That is courage in its purest form, the willingness to accept terrible risk for a cause larger than self-preservation. The 92% casualty rate among flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima stands as testimony to that courage and to its cost. They walked into fire, many knowing they would not walk out. They did it anyway. That is why they became casualties, and that is why they are remembered.